Good morning, colleagues. Thanks, Dr. Khan. Thank you, Principal. Our keynote speaker for this morning is Ms. Cynthia Hobbs. Ms. Hobbs is a lead educational specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. She has a deep interest in improving teaching quality. Ms. Hobbs has taught in primary schools, universities, and in courses for adults. In addition, Ms. Hobbs has conducted research on teaching practices, including intercultural bilingual math education. Prior to joining the IDB, Ms. Hobbs worked for 15 years at the World Bank, where she oversaw the preparation and execution of education projects in several areas, including early and pre-primary education, primary and secondary education, youth, and transitions from school to work. Cynthia holds a degree in psychology from Bates College in the USA and a master's degree in international education from Harvard University. Welcome, Ms. Hobbs.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to the CCEP for inviting me to address this very important topic. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you all confirm that you see it? Yes, I see that you see it. What I'm to present is very in line with what we've heard from the other speakers. We've been working very closely together with other partners to look for solutions to respond to the pandemic. Education as we know it has changed. The pandemic has generated a health crisis, an economic recession, and a learning crisis. All students from all education levels have been affected. Across the region, some 1.7 million students are out of school. We see fairly equal numbers of boys and girls and more secondary school students affected across the country. And here we see that distance education takes many forms. Since schools have closed, ministries have applied emergency responses using different forms of distance education. Delivery of printed materials, television, online platforms, and one very creative Jamaican teacher who set up a community blackboard to post lessons every day. She also gives tips to parents so they can teach their children at home. Soon you'll be seeing Sesame Street episodes on television in Jamaica and Suriname through a contract that the IDB has signed with Sesame to make those episodes available. Although teachers have shown great commitment and creativity to maintain ties with their students, we know that education systems and teachers were not well prepared for the transition to distance learning, and not all students have remained connected. There are economic and social impacts related to school closures. These losses affect individuals and countries. A recent World Bank study estimated that middle and high-income countries like the Caribbean countries will suffer earning losses of between 14 and 16% of GDP. Lost learning is due to temporary disconnection with schools, and the longer they're disconnected, students are disconnected, the more loss of learning occurs. Those affect later job opportunities, which lead to projected losses in lifetime earnings. Students also miss social interactions with peers and teachers at school, and school closures affect health and social well-being, especially for poor students who rely on school feeding and school health programs. There are inequities in the education system and differences in academic achievement between children from wealthy families and poor families, and between girls and boys. And these student achievement gaps were already wide even before the COVID-19 pandemic. In PISA results for Trinidad and Tobago, we see here on the right that the largest percent of low-performing students are from poor families in every subject area: reading, science, and mathematics. And on the left, we have the scores. Students from the wealthiest families scored some 90 points higher than students from the poorest families in all three subjects. The PISA report equates 30 score points with about 1 year of schooling. This means that the poor students are the equivalent of 3 school years behind their wealthy classmates. We've seen that lower performing students tend to come from poorer families, and my colleagues at the IDB have done calculations to show that student achievement in first grade can predict how a student will perform on the grade 6 exam to pass to secondary. This is a high-stakes exam because in most countries it determines where students will go to secondary school, and higher performing students have access to better schools with better resources. We see here that the students who score below the 40th percentile when exiting primary school have almost no chance of obtaining a CSEC certificate. That is 5 passes, including math and English. And we know that students that leave secondary with a CSEC certificate earn 40% more than those who do not obtain that CSEC certificate. So quality education in the early years and early detection of learning challenges are extremely important because learning gaps are very hard to overcome and can define a child's future. We also see differences by gender. Girls outperformed boys in all 3 countries, Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago, in both math and English CSEC exams in 2015, and a higher percent of girls, signified with this red dot, obtained their CSEC certificate. It is also notable that in all 3 countries, less than 50% of students achieved the CSEC certificate, which is the minimum requirement to enter university or better paying jobs. So what other factors will affect education post-COVID? The pandemic has caused an economic recession and projected drops in income generation from tourism and other service industries. We see negative growth rates projected for 2020 in all countries except Guyana, and this will mean less budget for social sectors, especially for education, since priority will be given to health and social protection. The IMF actually estimates a 7% reduction in spending for education across Latin America and the Caribbean in the next year. Based on a quick survey done by the IDB, we also see a heavy loss of jobs and business closures across the region, with losses much higher for low-income jobs than high-income jobs. This could indicate a need to diversify. Countries cannot rely solely on tourism and service industries or on single commodity markets such as gold and oil. The world is facing rapid changes in the demand for skills. Even before the pandemic, the 4th industrial revolution, climate change, and increased life expectancy have changed the trend in the demand for skills. COVID-19 will also bring changes in demands for skills, especially digital, socio-emotional, and lifelong skills. There's much less demand now for repetitive activities, a need for creation of new activities that demand new abilities, and lifelong learning skills. The data shows that we are already facing a learning crisis. Post-COVID, we're facing new restrictions and challenges. In this context, how do we move forward? What are the imperatives and opportunities for our education systems? We're transitioning from an emergency response to planning for the future. We now have an opportunity to better organize the education systems by collecting and using data, training teachers, providing better resources to teachers and students, involving families, and finding ways to reach students who have been disconnected. What questions can we ask to help us plan for the future? When and where do we learn? To safely reopen schools, we need to clean them, provide clean drinking water and soap, and set up flexible school schedules to allow for social distancing with smaller groups of students. But due to social distancing, some students will likely be at home at any given moment, which will require a blended learning approach. So how do we promote autonomous learning for students who are learning from a distance? And how do we engage others, like parents, to help teach? We have a moral imperative to provide quality education for all students, especially knowing what we do about existing learning gaps and predictive pathways for low-performing students. We also know that learning gaps are widening with school closures since some students have fewer resources for distance learning. How do students best learn? Once we assess the learning gaps compounded by the pandemic, we need to develop strategies to help students catch up, like tutoring and accelerated learning programs. This may mean teaching in a different way. One example that I read about recently is the Teaching at the Right Level program started by Pratham, an NGO in India. This program helps children develop foundational reading and math skills working with groups in grades 3 to 5. They start by testing children in basic skills, group them by learning level rather than age or grade, and teach those basic skills for concentrated periods of time. Retest, and then allow students to move individually through the levels as they progress. This program has been evaluated and has shown a positive impact on children's learning. More than 60 million children have benefited from the program in India and Africa. Similar adaptive learning using digital tools can allow students to move at their own pace. How can we better support students? Many students have felt anxiety during the pandemic for a variety of reasons. Separation from school and their friends, difficulties in connecting to school through distance learning, general anxiety of the unknown, possible death in the family, increases in domestic violence and abuse during quarantine, and loss of the safety that school can provide. All these issues require additional support and counseling services. And how do school leaders engage the community in new ways? Capitalizing on parents' greater involvement in schooling over the last few months. How do they foster teaching of life skills and socio-emotional learning? How do they help their teachers learn new things? School leaders need training in change management to lead the required changes in teaching and learning. Dr. Khan mentioned the importance of digital strategies. How can those strategies and technology help us to build resilient education systems? The first order of business is to bolster the Education Management Information Systems, or EMIS, and ensure that everyone is using them so that policymakers, school leaders, and teachers have access to accurate, up-to-date data on everything from school infrastructure to teacher qualifications and assignments to student achievement. What resources do we need for effective learning? Information from the EMIS can be used to make decisions to upgrade schools, expand connectivity, and provide digital devices to teachers. Students and teachers need much more training in the use of online and distance modalities in preparation for more blended teaching models. The IDB calculated readiness to use technology in several countries across Latin America and the Caribbean, and both in secondary schools and universities. only 60% of teachers and instructors were estimated to have the digital tools necessary for distance and online teaching. And having lived these last 3 months with 3 teenagers, I can assure you that some children are much more ready for distance learning than others. How do we know what students have learned? Digital strategies and testing, as well as EMIS data and analysis, can be used to identify students who need additional support and early interventions. What should students learn and how should they be certified? As I mentioned, adaptive learning using digital tools allows students to move at their own pace through the curriculum. And tertiary institutions could explore other types of certification. For example, the private sector is focusing more and more on what people know and accepting digital badges in place of university degrees. As we look to the future, how can we prepare better for uncertainties? We have to consider the possibility of future pandemics or climate disasters that require new school closures and distance learning responses, not to mention new school arrangements right now that will teach some students face-to-face and other students from a distance. With government budget cuts in the forecast, how can we forge different partnerships? For example, providing relevant and pertinent education and training and linking learning to jobs. Lifelong learning skills allow us to adapt and learn new skills for new jobs in a rapidly changing labor market. I just read about youth doing digital tracking of re-entering citizens and tourists. Excuse me. Let me start that again. I just read about youth doing digital tracking of re-entering citizens and tourists to be able to trace new COVID cases in Jamaica. And my son is in a high school aviation program learning to fly drones to deliver packages, carry out surveillance, and so forth. And how do universities leverage their research and knowledge base to contribute to solutions? Several Latin American universities generated masks and developed ventilators in the first months of the pandemic. Researchers can also study issues like the widening learning gaps, how to work with children with disabilities, how to reduce dropouts and retain students with the blended teaching and learning approach. So to wrap up, what do we need to ask ourselves as we look at the imperatives and opportunities for building resilient education systems in the Caribbean? How do we minimize inequities in the system? How do we regain learning losses? Who delivers education? What do we deliver? How do we deliver? Where do we deliver? How do we engage new partners in education? And is there a role for regional partnerships? Thank you very much for this moment to share some ideas with you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hobbs, for such an informative presentation. From your presentation, realize that we need demands for skills, socio-emotional development, digital skills. So we are here for question and answers, and some of the questions that were raised by participants in the discussion. Okay, the question is asked, learning from COVID-19, how can countries prepare teachers for the future in preparing students to be able to cope and manage this situation? One of the questions that is asked.
So this is a question that we are all asking because we are not even sure how we are reaching students, how many students we're reaching and how we're reaching them. We're not sure even if they're on screen and watching and going through online platforms, answering questions, whether they're learning and retaining that information, which is why I mentioned that the first important step is assessment to understand who is learning what, how much they're learning, and who has been disconnected during this time. And as Dr. Khan mentioned, there will be a need for training of teachers to help them learn how to reach students in these different modes. In this emergency response, it has been very one way. Students have been watching programs on television. Students have been doing learning online with online platforms. But there's been very little interaction between students. Just yesterday, we had a meeting with the government of Finland, who has very generously offered to partner with the IDB to offer teacher training in digital methods over the next 3 years to the Caribbean region. And our 6 member countries were involved in that discussion. And so.
Oh, she's frozen. Okay.
It's a question that we're all maybe one step ahead of us, such as Finland.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there's one last question. I think we only have a chance for one last question. And this one is, what can be done to reduce the gaps that exist in education for rich and poor, boys and girls, based on your data that you've presented? What can be done in the Caribbean to address that?
Well, my answer is always considered a bit radical, but the first thing we can do is make sure that every single secondary school is of high quality. So it doesn't matter which secondary school you place into, whether it's there wouldn't be the high performing schools and the low performing schools. So that a student at a high performing school automatically goes to university, and a student at a low performing school really never has that opportunity. So the first thing would be to equalize the quality of education across the schools, and then use programs that I described, like the one in India, which is, they did a pilot with 60 million students and showed that it was highly successful in raising learning achievement among poor students and low achieving students. So thinking about other ways, not necessarily having everyone in grade 3 because they're 8 years old, or in grade 6 because they're 12 years old, allowing students who move more quickly through some subjects to move quickly, and working more closely with the students who are having more difficulty learning, to give them more support. And this partnership that has been created with communities and with families could be taken advantage of. So we give more tools to parents as well to work with their students. In fact, in Jamaica, we did a pilot program 2 years ago in math, and we taught the parents math concepts. We did not do any interventions with the students or with the teachers. And we showed that with just 5 sessions with the parents to teach them basic mathematic concepts, this was for early learners for kindergarten and grade 1, that just to show parents basic concepts and teach them how to talk about math in everyday situations, in the supermarket, counting fruits, cooking together, telling time, concepts of in front of, behind, next to, etc., grouping things. Those students showed a significant improvement in their math learning after just 5 sessions with their parents. So we know that by working with parents and helping and empowering them to work with their children at home, we can also make gains, especially with the lower performing students. Thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. Thank you very much, Dr. Cole.